Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio. I've got John Ruffolo with us today. He is someone that I've had the privilege of interviewing before about his very compelling personal story. But today I want to talk to him about what he thinks about the election and the agenda for the current government of our country, because he wrote a really interesting article in the Globe and Mail, or co-authored one, about what he thought the agenda should be for the economy, for the business community. And he's frankly written, in addition, about immigration and about some other issues of late that he thinks really are things that we need to be paying attention to. So, John Ruffolo, welcome to the show, sir. What do you think about the
Thank you.
election? What do you think the agenda should be?
Well, on the election, I guess it went according to what the polls had expected. I think Brian, you and I were just chatting. What surprised me was we talk about geographic polarization, but what surprised me was the age polarization as well. I was surprised to see that the age groups between 18 to 54 predominantly voted conservative, and the age groups from 55 above overwhelmingly voted liberal. So, what, and we've ended up in a situation where we're kind of looking a little bit like the United States now, where in the question will be, will we be a multi-party system, or will it be this duo system? But the message seemed to be clear, irrespective of what your policies are. The message is Canada had gone way too far left in the past decade, largely due to the alliance with the NDP, and Canadians on the whole were very concerned about it. The Conservatives came out pushing for policies that were right of center, and the early days of Carney now seems to be acknowledging a desire to move the Liberal Party back to its center. And when you say center, I would say from an economic policy perspective, it actually even seems to be a little bit of center right, which will be very interesting to see what is the daylight then. If that statement is true, what will be the daylight between the Conservative and Liberal parties on a go-forward basis?
What do you think those policies are? Because you wrote about this in the Globe and Mail. What do you think the policies are that he
Yeah,
needs to move on right away?
well, it was fascinating. This is the part of the op-ed I wrote. It was three pillars. Pillar one was you got to manage the spend, right? And people, of course, had a heart attack and was immediately interpreting as cutting of services because they're looking at what Musk was spouting off in the United States, but rather it was the massive growth of the public sector, far disproportionate to the growth of the economy, and the inefficiencies and lack of adoption of technologies, etc. So you got to manage government efficiently like you would any sort of business.
So, do
Uh,
you think we're going to
Card,
have a Doge equivalent here?
no, I don't think we have a Doge equivalent, but what was interesting, that was the big attack early on against Polyev, and you saw Carney's first statement was looking at managing costs in government and
Yeah.
introducing technology. I found that fascinating. That wasn't really stated before. Now it is. Reading a little bit of the tea leaves. Now,
So you're a
when
technology guy, and you've made a lot of
yes,
money investing in technology. Do you think that artificial intelligence can actually help us improve the government, services and bring down expenses to the extent that Carney's been sort of suggesting? Keeps on saying, "Well, artificial intelligence." Is it actually going to help us?
well, people love to go to the sexy memes of artificial intelligence. I would just deal with intelligence first. So let me give you an example. At the most mundane levels, and most businesses are now adopting it, is try calling CRA and let me know how long you're in the line. Let me know. It's the only organization that I've experienced in the past 12 months where there was actually a busy signal. I didn't even think those existed anymore. What do companies use? They use chatbots, or they use all online call center folks. And so many of the questions that CRA handles, and what typically comes out when you do analysis for private companies. 80% of the questions are the same 6 questions.
Yep.
So you adopt technology to offload so many folks. There is no reason why we increased employment in the CRA by 40% in 5 years. Like, it was crazy. Now, and the question will be, and again, people jumped to a cut in services, but at the end of the day, taxpayers are owed a responsibility that when our hard-earned money, when it goes to the government has a responsibility to spend it efficiently. And that is step one. And Carney has said he will do that. And I think that, you know, the fear of what Musk is doing in the United States is not going to translate here. It's a very, very different environment. And frankly, here in Canada, that's not what the expectation was from either party.
What specific policies do you think he needs to work on? Clearly, the visit to Washington and to President Trump is to work on tariffs and USMCA. But you know, he's getting lots of pressure on pipelines, on infrastructure, on
Yeah,
housing. What do you think of those policies?
yeah. So this is the prosperity agenda for Canada, right? And this is the part that has frustrated me. And Brian, you and I have chatted about this for a long time. Is Canada needed to deal with its own backyard over the last decade. And frankly, I'm not even blaming the last decade. It's really been a compounding problem over the last 3 decades. Canada, from an economic perspective, has gotten fat and lazy. And from that perspective, we've done the easy thing. We've imported from the United States. We've relied upon job creation when foreign-based multinationals come into Canada. We didn't think about economic nationalism, and I don't say that from a ownership of state property. I'm saying this about, we need to build things. We need to build companies here and have the jobs here. It doesn't mean that we don't go internationally, but it means owning the rights here, owning the intellectual property here. We've forgotten all about this. And while we're not going to be doing this right now, at some point in time, we're gonna say thank you to Trump, not because what he's doing is completely chaotic and no explanation. He's finally allowed Canadians to realize how exposed we are when you have a supposed friend in another government. But we should always remember, there's no friends that are other governments. They all serve their own constituents and purpose. And the real issue for Canada is we allowed ourselves to be that exposed. And and the truth of the matter is, and it's great that we got to try to calm this individual down in the White House, but there is nothing in our control in Canada that is going to change the minds in the United States directly. They will do what they want to do. Right now, they're frankly not even thinking about Canada. They're actually thinking about China right now. So, because Canadians cannot control the actions of the White House in the United States, what we can control is building great businesses here. And as a technology guy, I can tell you, start with your greatest advantages, and that's natural resources. It pains for me to say that, but that's the truth of the matter. And in the short term, what does that mean? Focusing in our oil and gas and mining and our geographic defense. These are the very immediate things to deal with and will deliver the greatest dollars. It doesn't bring you long-term sustainable prosperity, however. Canada's role as a player in the digital economy will, but we can't just jump there. And if we get the right building blocks done right today, build things here, consume things here in Canada, we will have to focus in on import substitution. So maybe, Brian, you might like your California wine, but maybe you're going to like your BC wine or your Prince Edward County wine, and it's okay.
I love BC wine, but I can't buy it.
Well, then, right. So well, there's also another reason in there. The actual size of the market of BC wine is very, very small, and they're actually having issues with respect to not only fire but for infestation. But the point is, we talk about the auto industry. The auto industry, in my view, was really gone in 2009 in the financial crisis. And remember, we paid, I can't remember the number, $13 billion to bribe them to stay. But the reality is we were relying on a US-based company to provide that economic input. Why didn't we consider at that time to build something here in Canada? I know that we had that great project, the Avro project. I love that. It was, could we do something like this in Canada? Why not? Right? Why don't we build the things here? And I think now we're going to be thinking about that, consuming it here, and also diversifying the exporting of those goods that we build here. And if anybody thinks that we're going to, disassociate with exporting the United States, is in dreamland. Right now in Ontario, it's almost 80% of our exports. What number should it be? Is it 70%? Should it be 60%? It won't be zero. And yes, we should be diversifying, but the truth of the matter is geographic proximity and integration of supply chains matter. So the US is going to matter. And, accept it that the next 2 years, at least in the United States, there's going to be chaos and volatility until the US midterms. And I'm suspecting that Trump's going to lose one of the houses in the US during the midterms. And so accept that that volatility might be the case, but let's not stop with our own domestic prosperity. And that is the key for the future success.
So, Carney's been talking a lot about getting rid of interprovincial trade barriers, and that would make BC wine more available in Ontario and allow us to import it. And I think that makes a ton of sense and certainly would go toward your import substitution argument. He's been talking about, and lots of people have been talking about, whether there's a business case for a pipeline to take natural gas, oil to the West Coast and an LNG facility.
Or
so
East
that
Coast.
effectively diversifies our customers for oil and gas. But what you're raising is a really interesting issue. You're talking about economic nationalism in regards to technology, and you mentioned the Avro Arrow. People have talked about Bombardier and subway trains or fast fast rail trains or cars, and lots of people have said, people said there was no opportunity for a new car company, and then Elon Musk creates Tesla, and there is a new car company. We had Bricklin, which was a fascinating idea from the Atlantic Canada at one point in time. So what are those things that you think the government needs to do from an economic nationalism standpoint that helps either industrial companies or, even better, the digital technology companies that you're talking about?
Sure.
Some people say that we created AI, but China and US are the leaders in AI today. Canada's not. How do we own some of these opportunities?
Exactly. We do a damn good job on all of the research and development. We do a horrible job on the commercialization. So let me give you two concrete examples, for your listeners. Let's talk about something like mining. And we talked about in 2009. In fact, I was working with the federal government at the time saying, don't subsidize GM and Ford because they're just going to come back at the table and asking for more. And at the time, Elon Musk at the time was actually looking for a manufacturing jurisdiction for EV. And I thought, what a great opportunity. And we have excellent battery research technology in Canada. And as a venture capital investor, I was seeing them from coast to coast. And we have the raw ingredients in this province that would actually supply, the batteries. And whether it's cadmium, nickel, graphite, lithium, you name it, all the components here. Yet the supply chain was largely Chinese supply chain. The intellectual property was owned, in the case of the battery plants, by Swedish company. And we were just doing low-end assembly for about 1,000 workers. How about saying things like, if we want to create industries, you must use the raw material that we have in the ground. You must process it and refine it here. You must use it in the supply chain. And now all of a sudden, if we find that we don't want to build the entire car, why don't you build the most valuable part of the car right now, which is the battery? That could have all been owned here. And what you're doing is you're transforming what was otherwise a very low end resource into a much higher value in the value chain of a product. That's what I mean. And we have to just be purposeful about it. There's no reason why we can't do that. Let me give you another
But John,
very
I'll give you a couple of questions in that regard. The
yeah,
margin on unrefined natural gas is far higher. We sell natural gas to the United States. The U.S. does the liquefaction and sells it around the world at a 20% higher price. We sell oil to the United States. They refine it, turn around, and sell it back to Atlantic Canada as refined. So, maybe going back to your first argument, we've taken the easy way out. We have
yeah,
done, the Afro-Aero. The U.S. told Diefenbaker supposedly, don't do the Afro-Aero. Where you need to be part of
right,
our North American aeronautical business. So we got the same problem right now with the jets that we're buying. We got the same problem with the icebreakers that
absolutely.
we're buying. If we're going to do what you're talking about, it's going to cost more. If we want to have a made in Canadian product, it's going to cost us more.
When you say cost us more, what, right now or in the long run? Because it's costing us dearly right now. It's
So
really
you're saying
costing our
we should
sovereignty.
we should bite the bullet and
It
accept higher
is.
costs now for the long-term benefit.
Absolutely. We're going to keep the jobs. We're going to keep the intellectual property. Let me give you one example that will, should be having you shaking your boots. I mean, we just don't think about it. What is every business now, pretty much in Canada, how are they operating their business from a technological perspective? They're leveraging largely three cloud data providers. They call it the hyperscalers in the United States. So Microsoft, Google, and Amazon. Those are the big three, all US owned. So everybody's data, their entire lifeblood of a business is now controlled on those data centers. The United States has what's called the US Cloud Act. It is the right of the US president, uh, in the name of national security, to access any data residing on US based multinationals and to hand over that data to the US government without notifying the Canadian government or the company whose data has been breached. And if you do not comply with that, you will be subject to criminal fines and imprisonment. You don't believe me on that? Look at what Brad Smith at Microsoft just announced last week to the EU and said publicly, if the US demands that information, we will take them to court, which was
So
a
so
way of
could
saying
could your
they
firm
could do that.
finance a Canadian cloud?
Pardon me?
Could your company finance a Canadian cloud? Because what you're
Absolutely.
effectively saying is we need to have a
That's
Canadian cloud.
exactly what we're going to do. That's exactly what all the discussions. How about communications? You remember when during the early days of the Ukraine-Russia war, and the Ukrainians were terrified because Elon Musk had somehow suggested that he was going to turn off Starlink because he was trying to appease the Russians, and blah 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 happened. Musk very quickly said, "No, no, no, I'm there." Uh, we talk about our satellite communications for Canada in the Arctic, our Arctic sovereignty. Where do you think, a physical attack or the stealing of land from Canada will be from a foreign based? It's going to come in the Arctic, and how do you surveil on that? Through satellite communications. What if you don't own those satellite communications? What will you do? Canada's got two outstanding satellite communications companies. One is Telesat, long time there, and a very new emerging player called Kepler. What about supporting those, right? That's what we have to do. They're all around. They're all around. We're just being fat and lazy and taking the easy way. And that's how you build a nation. That's how the Scandinavian countries did it as well, too. They couldn't do everything, but in a few of the good industries, they got around it. And what we really need is we need Team Canada around these businesses. and we need to support these businesses. And the thing I will say, they're not looking for handouts. They're looking for revenues. So buy Canadian and they'll take care of the rest. And this is the thing. For somehow, and it drives me insane on how Canadians think, particularly in government. If there's two equal companies, a bigger foreign-based one and a smaller Canadian one, with products or services equal, right, yet indistinguishable, we tend to pick the American or the large foreign. You know the old adage, you don't get fired for hiring IBM? Well, it's alive and well. And now is the time to say, oh, Jesus, we've been doing this for 30 years. You know, they've been doing the best job that they can, but now be purposeful in what you're doing. Use procurement as an economic weapon now. You haven't been doing that. It's been viewed as a taxpayer expense. So hence your comment on the cost. It's not cost, it's how you bill. And that's the mindset change that we need in Canada.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We're again being joined by John Ruffolo of Mavericks Private Equity. John, we've just chatted about what your agenda for Carney would be, Prime Minister Carney, going forward. But now let's turn to some of the other arguments you made recently, if we could. You've argued about raising capital and how challenging raising capital is in the Canadian market, and particularly for technology companies. What do you think Canada can do and or the government can do in that regard, sir?
Yeah, this is a trend line that I'm just watching very carefully. One of the biggest impediments to scale globally that entrepreneurs will say is access to risk capital. And that's specifically to venture capitalists in particular, should they require that capital. And so the real big question is, so who's holding the capital? Now, you have government sources of capital, which is fine, and government does a decent job on that with respect to the BDC and EDC. But there is a lot of capital that's locked into pension funds that have been used to be deployed to other foreign countries. I think, short of, trying to legislate that, which I think is going down a very, very slippery slope. I think looking at our capital pools and, seeking their support in deploying capital to support venture capitalists who ultimately deploy the capital into entrepreneurs. And then B, the other area is, and you saw this on one of the platforms for Carney as an example, looking at tax policy. So they're looking at flow-through shares, similar to what the oil and gas and mining industry has done for years. You had Pierre Poilievre suggest it called a capital gain rollover. Basically, if you have a capital gain from the disposition of an investment or whatever capital property, as long as you reinvest it in a Canadian business or property, there is a deferral of that gain. I mean, those tax policy ideas could be very impactful to unleashing more capital, particularly as it relates to risk capital.
So the United States has this 1031 rollover, which you're probably referring to, sort of, that
Yes.
allows people that invest in real estate that incur a capital gain to roll it over into a new investment in real estate of equal or greater value and defer their capital gain. Are you suggesting really extending that to any business, any investment?
Canadian based, yeah. Now, what Poilievre had suggested was, like, I would limit it to Canadian based businesses and as defined, as opposed to putting, allowing for that rollover to apply if you sell the shares of one public company for another public company. I'm not sure that's where I would direct my public policy. But we have defined, for example, what a small business corporation is, or using a definition like that. So I think it should be a very targeted rollover so that we're stimulating more capital going into Canadian-based businesses.
Some people think that there's been too much of an incentive for people to invest in real estate, and because of that investment in real estate, and because real estate is appreciated, a whole bunch of risk capital that could have gone into technology and or more productive parts of the economy have actually gone into just buying more condos and more real estate.
Yeah.
So would you apply that same capital tax rollover to real estate as well, and would that not rob the balance of the economy?
Well, here's an interesting the other side of your comment, which I've heard that comment many times, is the rollover rule is what permits the U.S. real estate market to be far more liquid, and it actually enables people to move up. Because remember, the rule only works is that if you buy new real estate within a time frame that's of the same value or higher. So what they believe it does, it allows new market entrants to come in and allows the movement of capital through a pyramid of real estate in the United States. Your point, though, is a valid point that we have in Canada, massive amount of dead capital sitting in real estate. But the question,
dead capital, that's inflammatory. Dead capital, seriously?
It's dead capital. It's dead capital. It's not productive. It's the least productive. If you're sitting in you buy your house 30 years ago, and yes, you've got appreciation, but for 30 years, that capital is not productive capital. Yes, it's satisfying your living quarters, but what is it doing from an economic perspective? And one of the issues and the differences is Canadians have no taxation on the principal residence exemption. And the U.S., from the opposite perspective, is that they have interest deductibility. What is absolutely fascinating about those two policies, and a variety of countries have similar policies another way, interest deductibility favors those who are younger and growing their assets. The principal residence exemption favors those that already have the assets. And hence, we saw in this election, we had a massive divide between the boomers and the non-boomers, or more specifically, the 55-plus-year-olds voted for Liberals, and those below 55 voted for Conservatives. Those two policies, which some people would say is sacrosanct, go ask a 28-year-old person who doesn't have a house and says you could fund your house by using your tax deductions from your earnings. You might get a very different answer. So in the United States, when you ask this very same question, you say, have you paid off your mortgage? You know what the response is? What the hell for? Because I can get a 30-year mortgage, the interest is deductible, and I use that savings to invest in equities or other investments. That's my point on dead capital. So the United States unleashes that capital. I'm not saying one method is better than the other, but I am saying what tax policy could actually do and how it impacts the availability of capital.
That's really interesting that you describe the mortgage interest deductibility available in the United States as benefiting young people getting into the home buying sector of their lives, and the Canadian principal residence deduction benefiting the elderly people that have already got their homes. And so that is interesting. The tax policy has benefited one age group over another. I want to get onto some other issues, but one last question on taxes, because you raised this flow-through share tax idea. Mm-hmm. It's always made me wonder, why do we have flow-through share taxation opportunities only for mining and gas, and not for the balance of the economy? Like you think about your business and the technology businesses that you've invested in. As you may know, I've been involved in pharmaceuticals and biotech and mm-hmm. green tech and things like that. Why is it that they're not getting flow-through shares? And you think about, we had income trusts back until, what was it, a Halloween surprise that Jim Flaherty outlawed all those income tax, those income trusts long ago. But those income trusts are available really only in REITs for real estate. So for some reason, we've got this tax benefit for mining, gas, and real estate, but not for what I would argue, I think what you've argued, sort of more innovative parts of our industry. How come?
Yeah, it's a very good question. Now, I would say for the technology industry, in particular for biotechnology and clean tech, where the gestation cycle of the business is so far off into the future as compared to more traditional technology, it's a really good question. Now, one of the challenges, though, and this is one of the differences, if you follow the flow through shares for mining and oil and gas, this has been a big reason why the junior resource sector in Canada is, I was going to say very strong, probably not as strong as we would have liked it, but when they changed and allowed junior oil producers in particular to qualify for flow through shares, it made them very popular. And the reason is, in a very simple example, if you buy $100 worth of the shares, you get a 50-cent tax deduction. So now you have $50 invested. And then when you ultimately sell your shares, you want to make more than, as long as you make $50 or more, you have a break even. Where it doesn't hold as well is if you have the complete risk of loss. So if you end up selling your shares for nothing, you just lost 50 cents. So that's not a very smart thing to do. For the resource sector, this was one of the problems when it was pure exploration, because the risk of complete loss, was much higher. When they added junior oil producers, the risk of loss was very low. And in fact, for about 15 years or so in a row, I've invested in junior oils. And in those 15 years, only 2 times did I lose. And 13 other times I sold more than for my cost base. So we just got to make sure that when these are being designed, if there is a complete risk of loss, the market won't find these attractive in the first place.
Let me change the topic if I could, sir. You made an interesting comment on social media in regards to Germany dropping its opposition to nuclear power, and you were effectively, I think, suggesting that Canada should
Yes.
focus more on nuclear power. Tell us about that, if you could.
Yeah, this is actually a frustrating area. Canada was a world leader in nuclear power with our very famous CANDU reactors. We did all of the things we kept on talking about in the past. We built the technology, we exported the technology, and then the issues started to occur from various disasters. You first had Chernobyl, then you had Fukushima, and what happened is it got murky from a public perspective or public impression perspective of nuclear. Nuclear energy is 100% renewable and clean. There is zero doubt about that. The issue is really about what do you do with the radioactive waste, whether it's the spent fuel or the spent rods. And we had 2 disasters that were relatively unique, but there are countries that, not sure Japan is a great place in the world where they're subject to earthquakes and tsunamis to have a nuclear policy. But if you're in Canada, where you're landlocked, or if you are in France, which has 70% of its entire grid supported by nuclear energy, or if you were in Germany, and Germany succumbed to really some, very strong environmental concerns right after, in particular, Fukushima, and Germany announced they're shutting down of all of their reactors. And they announced a shutdown in 2011. And, Russia comes along And this has well been discussed. One of the reasons why Russia uh, took advantage of the energy issue was that Russia supplies natural gas largely to Europe. And when Germany, who was the most powerful country aside from France in Europe, shut it down, they knew that Germany was going to be vulnerable. So what does Russia do? They go and they take over Crimea, and virtually no opposition, because Russia knows, hey, I've got control over your energy. And this is the biggest issue now, is now you can see energy security equals national security. And ultimately, Crimea was never going to be the first stop point for Russia. It was going to be the Ukraine. And one of the concerns that people are having, is it going to be the Baltics? Is it going to be Poland, etc.? And Germany finally realized, oh my God, I can't be this vulnerable. And so in Canada, we have this, we're blessed with carbon based energies, but it's not renewable. And we got to be really careful. And we also have the environmental concerns. There is a tremendous opportunity for Canada to reinvigorate its nuclear program. And here's the interesting thing, Brian. If you look at the two probably most powerful renewable technologies, it's actually the same technology. Solar power, which captures, the energy from the sun, and in nuclear, particularly not nuclear fission, which is what we've had for the last 50 plus years in Canada, but nuclear fusion, which replicates the power of the sun. You end up with the two leading renewable technologies that are actually the same thing, but conceived or grabbed in different ways. And this is a great opportunity for Canada to go through the nuclear side. Now, of course, trying to figure out, and a lot of countries are trying to figure out, how do you change the radioactive concerns in the event that there's a meltdown or a storage issue, etc. But at least that's the technology issue that is solvable. It hasn't been solved yet, but a lot of countries are, and this is a great opportunity for Canada.
I agree with you completely. I think when you think that the only other country that has a big resource of uranium is Kazakhstan, obviously controlled by Russia. I think that you're completely right, and to equate energy security with national security, I think is quite right. I would frankly take it one step farther and say even liquefied natural gas, which is a lot cleaner than a lot of other sources of carbon-based energy, is something we should be supplying to Asia and to Europe, because
Yes.
it would be a lot better than them being dependent on Saudi Arabia, Russia, or Venezuela.
Or on so here's the funny thing. This is what I also comment. Watch the unintended consequences. So LNG is not a permanent solution, but it's a good transition solution. If we simply replaced the use of coal by LNG, the amount of GHG emissions from a carbon perspective would drop greater than any single thing that we can do today. So what was the outcome of when Germany realized, Russia has us? They switched to coal burning. Like, that was the ramification. And 20% now the German grid is based on coal when it wasn't before. That was number one. Number two, Germany came to Canada first, pleading to Canada,
and we said it wasn't a business case.
We said, go to hell. So what does Germany do? Germany realized they had their back against the wall, and they went to Qatar. And Qatar was more than happy to supply it. This is the geopolitical national security issue that Canada, we just, kick it in our own goal. And again, it's not to suggest that LNG is the panacea, but man, and you save the security issues, you deal with, at least in the near term, GHG issue, and Canada becomes richer. Not bad, all three.
I think it makes a lot of sense. I could go on asking you questions about different topics forever, but we're almost out of time. We're going to take a quick break for some messages. We'll be back with some concluding comments in just a minute with John Ruffolo from Mavericks Private Equity. Stay with us, everyone. Back in two. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We've had a great conversation with John Ruffolo of Mavericks Private Equity. I did a show with him about his injury and how he got through that and coming back. That is available on YouTube. I'll post a link to it in the show. It is an incredibly compelling, inspirational interview, and I highly recommend it. And I've had the pleasure of chatting with John Ruffolo about technology and the economy previously, and it's fantastic today to chat with him. Number one, in the first segment about an agenda for our new Prime Minister, Mark Carney, and number two, some other suggestions that we've talked about in our second segment about an agenda for Canada. But I want to finish, if I could, with an article that you posted and a comment that you made about culture. And what you said was that you foster a culture of radical candor and transparency. Radical candor and transparency. I think that's important in relationships, in companies, and frankly, with our government. Tell me why you think it's so important.
I do think this is an issue in Canada in that we don't speak out enough. And there is a undercurrent of fear that if you tell the truth, whether your job, your personal relationships, etc., are at risk. And yet anyone who is speaking out and speaking out with integrity and what you really believe in, and again, you can't spew nonsense. If people have an opposing view, that is great. But both views, that are in support of Canada are equally, encouraged. And I do think that, whether it's in business, whether it is, you had indicated, personal relationships, but the fear of someone of dislike or someone disagreeing with you is a Canadian trait. And one of the things that I saw in this election in particular was I've not seen more debate on both sides of an issue in any other election. And I thought that was absolutely wonderful. However, what does bother me is some folks watching the debates and saying, you know what, but I kept my mouth quiet, but I saw what you wrote or what have you. But I said, how come you didn't chime in? I goes, oh, well, if I do, I'm going to get on the wrong side. Or B, it might be a bit of a telling of Canada when 40% of the workforce are government workers and people, on the dole of the government directly or indirectly, and they're afraid to speak out in fear of the money might not be coming any further if you speak out. That is an indictment of Canada, frankly, and part of the challenge that, we really need to change, because if we're not being honest on what is the problem in the first place, I would say good luck with any potential solutions.
Are you able really to foster a company with radical transparency?
Well, we do at Mavericks. And let me tell you, people immediately go, wow, that's great. I love that. There's no hidden agendas. However, you do have to remember that means that you will get comments that are quite radically candor, and some people will say it and then they don't like it, and they don't like the honesty as well. So from my perspective on there, the issue is not with the deliverer, as long as it's respectful and constructive. It's the recipient. And if the recipient cannot take the message for what it is, that it's the viewpoint of somebody and they're using it honestly, Then the issue is with the recipient. And it's not for all businesses, but I'll tell you, when you have this radical candor and there's no hidden agendas, and there is, brutal honesty, the trust that is developed within the team is I think the magical end state. It is easier, by the way, to do it with a smaller organization like a Mavericks. It's much more difficult to do it with a larger organization. And frankly, when there is blowback in a larger organization, that's not a reflection of the employees. It's the reflection of the leadership of that organization who don't want to hear feedback that might be viewed as critical. And, my response to that would be, well, maybe you're in the wrong organization.
I think it comes down to leadership. And I had the honor of working for Jim Pattison. I'm not sure if you've had the opportunity to meet Jim Pattison, but he was an amazing gentleman to work with. And he said numerous different things, but I'll give you two of the things that he told me at one point in time. We had these quarterly divisional meetings where we travel around North America and meet for half a day with all the senior executives of each one of the business units for about 2.5 weeks every quarter. And he would say, I want you to ask the toughest question you possibly can. But Brian, what we really want is the answer. So if you're smart, don't catch the guy by surprise. Let him know the night before or the 2 days before that you're going to ask that tough question. So he can be prepared and answer it, because you don't want the gotcha question. What you want is to ask the tough question, but to get the answer. And so, don't throw someone under the bus. Make sure they're ready and prepared to answer your question. The second thing he said is, I never speak first in a meeting, because when I'm in a meeting, if I speak first, people will say what they think I want to hear, or they'll only agree with me. And so I've hired a whole bunch of smart people. I want all you smart people to ask the questions, to make the comments first. And then I get the benefit, because I'm the boss, of listening to everybody and thinking about what the true right answer is in the end. And he really did that. He led by listening. And I think that leading by listening, and then, he owned the company. He was the billionaire. He had the right to make the final decision and responsibility, but he wanted to listen to everyone else first. I thought that was showing leadership. John, it's been a real pleasure chatting with you tonight, and I really enjoy following you. If other people want to, get benefits of your thoughts, what's the best way to do that? Is it through LinkedIn or what?
Yeah, LinkedIn's probably the best. That's where I do communicate a lot of the thoughts around public policy.
I think that today's conversation, where we talked about, first of all, an agenda for our new Prime Minister, and then second of all, an agenda for Canada, and then finally, really some suggestions for companies and leaders of companies, was really helpful. John Ruffolo, Mavericks Private Equity, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Brian.
That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thank you for joining. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online at www.saga960am.ca. On my podcasts and videos go up on my website, briancrombie.com, and on social media, on YouTube, and on podcast servers as soon as the radio show gets broadcast. Good night, everybody. Thanks.